Well, hello and welcome to the time.
Very active
Hello and welcome to the first in a three-part discussion series on the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season and the role of the Department of Infrastructure, the Ministry of Infrastructure's response plan as we move ahead with what is expected to be a pretty active Atlantic hurricane season. My name is Shannon Lebourne. Joining me on the discussion table for this first part in the series, the Director of Works to my immediate right here at the Department of Infrastructure. He is Mr. Angel Shalmine. To Mr. Shalmine's immediate right, our Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Department of Infrastructure, Ports and Energy, Mr. Calvin Lee, and the Director of Met Services, a very familiar face on local television, Mr. Andrew Joye. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on this discussion program. We want to begin with perhaps the forecast, what the outlook is for this 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Can you share some insight on that?
Yes, I can. Well, we'll have to start with 2020, the beginning. It's a year of extremes. So we've actually started with a dry season. The Ministry of Agriculture actually issued a water emergency. And coming out of that into the hurricane season, the forecast is for a very active season. The season started off in May, a month early, with two tropical storms, Arthur and Buffer. And then in June, we had Cristobal and Dolly. And then July, we in the middle of July right now, and we have Edward and Faye. So it is coming on as a very active season already. Yeah.
Are we seeing climate change coming into our backyard? You said that the season started pretty earlier this year.
Yes. Over the last 5 years, the season has started off most of the time in May instead of June.
What's the cause for this?
Well, it's the climatic conditions, and the Earth is actually in a drying out period. So that is causing systems to, like the sea surface temperatures are getting warmer, so then that would enhance the formation of tropical storms. But I must say that the storms will form away from the Caribbean, more or less. So it's in the Atlantic or closer to the US.
Right. So we have warmer climatic conditions which will result
In more intense storms.
Intense storms for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane
Yes.
season. What impact do we expect these increased climatic conditions and intense storms to have on infrastructure here in Saint Lucia and across the region?
Right. So across the region and in Saint Lucia particularly, over the last few years, we have noticed, based on the intensity of these storms, we've had more significant damage. So you have, with more intense rainfalls, a greater level of flooding. If you have higher winds, you have a lot of crop damage to other types of infrastructure. So it's what we've seen is throughout the region, Dominica is a prime example of the impact of these intense storms, that significant aspects of the physical infrastructure have been damaged. Roadways have been cut off, homes have been lost, and so on. So the impact is quite severe on countries like ours, our small economies.
Of course, we'll delve a lot deeper in that as we go into discussion and when we speak in the second and third part as to building resilience, because if we expect the impact to be such great on infrastructure, there is a huge discussion that we can have as to what we can do.
We can talk about building resilience into our
limit the
planning
impacts.
as well. Yeah.
But let's move on and speak with the Director of Works here. What sort of role does the Department of Infrastructure, and the DPS can come in on this question as well, what is the role of the department in the immediate aftermath of storm activity?
Right. So the immediate aftermath of weather-related storm activity in Saint Lucia, the Department of Infrastructure is one of the first responders. We have the responsibility after the the severe impacts of the storm have gone through, to come in and to try to restore the road network and communications as quickly as possible. So again, not going into details of it at the moment, but we come in and try to open up the roadways and make it accessible to the various other service providers so that communication can be maintained. We can get access to various communities to serve persons who may be in need of it. So it's quite important that we get on there as well.
Yeah, and this could be done by, this is normally done by our engineers, our technicians, going out there and gathering all the information, carrying out the assessment, and that information relayed back to our ministry, where we would have had our emergency operating center, which is normally chaired by the Deputy Permanent Secretary.
A very critical role, the Department of Infrastructure, very important in the immediate aftermath of a storm, as explained by the DPS. It's essential to get communication going and to ensure that the various other first responders are able to go out there and handle their duties.
Especially clearing of the carriageways and bridges and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Another major function of ours is the maintenance and management of our shelters, our hurricane shelters. Mr. Shalman, maybe you can tell us what has been done to prepare those shelters ahead of the season.
Well, on a normal basis, what we do before the start of the season, we carry out our shelter assessments. Now, it must be said that this is not, we do not look at it as a hurricane shelter, but as an emergency shelter, because this could be used for any other emergency. For instance, a fire, you could have persons use those shelters. Our technicians, our building officers go out and have a look at those shelters. We look at the critical issues, water storage, the roof structure, the electrical installations. So it's a function that is done, it's a multifunction, and we also try to do that in collaboration with the shelter managers and NEMO, so that at the end of the day, when the emergency shelter list is being prepared, we would have had a comprehensive assessment of those shelters. So this is one of the prime functions that we carry out just before the hurricane season.
How are those shelters identified, first to begin?
Well, it must be said that we do not have purpose-built shelters. So, in collaboration with the community disaster groups, we identify buildings that the owners, that's on the private side. So we're talking about dance halls and stuff like that, where the owners give us that go ahead that their buildings would be used as emergency shelters. We look at churches, we look at majority of our schools are actually emergency shelters. So this is how we actually come about, but it's not something that is done in isolation.
And then a lot of the time, these are central locations that persons may be able to access.
Accessible. Speak about the collaboration, because it's not just yourself, it's NEMO as well.
It's
and
NEMO,
there are a number of domestic stakeholders. Speak about that collaboration and how it works to ensure better management of those emergency shelters.
Over the years, previously what you would have found out that the Ministry of Infrastructure would have tried to carry out all of those assessments on their own. But more recently, we have tried to, like I said, involve the shelter managers, for instance, the community disaster groups, because those are the persons that live in the community. Those are the persons that has the institutional knowledge of what happens during the storms, and which they could tell you which buildings are probably not suitable for certain storm events or certain capacities. And so you have the Ministry of Health collaborating with us. You have social transformation, and a number of other ministries come in, and especially our electrical department plays a crucial part as well.
Now, we living in a COVID reality, and it's not expected to go away anytime now. Is consideration given to the protocols of social distancing in preparing those emergency shelters?
As we speak, Shannon, there has been a lot of meetings and workshops with respect to getting into hurricane shelters amid the COVID period. So it has created a lot of discussion, and NEMO along with CDEMA and the OECS, and there are lots of organizations working along that, and they have come up with a number of protocols pertaining to hurricane shelters as we move into that season. So for instance, we would look at the social distancing moving into a shelter. How do you bring persons, how do you admit persons into that shelter? So you're talking about having temperatures taken, having more of an emergency crew on hand. So it has actually increased the demand on the operations of a traditional hurricane shelter. So no longer would persons just walk into a shelter. The shelter managers now have a more critical role, and it's not about just the shelter managers now. The shelter managers would have a complete team along with them. So yeah, there's been a lot of work done along those lines, and the protocols have been set. One of the things that it has created as well is the need for us to now look at more buildings, because you would need in the social distancing. You would need more space, and you're trying to keep families together, and you're trying to just keep the whole protocol set out by the different entities in place.
I know it's an ongoing discussion, and
it is still ongoing, and we're hoping that we will not have to go through this whole protocol COVID-19 getting into hurricane shelters, but the conversation is on and the protocols are in place.
Absolutely. I think it would be satisfying to a number of our citizens to know that we are beginning the discussion to ensure that our emergency shelters are.
And I must say, Shannon, it's not just the discussion. There have been a number of simulation workshops held around the island, which involves admitting persons into shelters amid the COVID period.
Excellent.
So the sensitization is ongoing.
Excellent. We'll continue the discussion in just a short while. You're viewing the very first in a three-part discussion series produced by the Department of Infrastructure to look at the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season and the role and responsibility of this very important department, the Department of Infrastructure. We will be back right after this.
Hurricanes can be very destructive. Although we can't stop them, we can lessen the effects of hurricanes on our lives and property by preparing. Start by having a family disaster management plan in place long before the hurricane season starts. Discuss your plan with your family and ensure that everyone knows their role.
Okay everyone, let's go over our family disaster plan from last year.
You should also have an emergency supplies kit with items that do not need refrigeration and will last for some time. Include canned foods, water, clothing, first aid supplies, flashlights, battery-powered radios, batteries, sanitation and hygiene supplies, medication, special need items for infants, the elderly and persons with disabilities. Remember to regularly replace items like water, food, medication and batteries. Ensure that your home and vehicle insurance coverage are appropriate and up to date, and secure important documents in a watertight container. Ensure that your house and property is in good condition and can weather the storm. Trim branches away from your house and prune all dead or weak trees on your property. The Atlantic hurricane season is from June to November, but preparedness is year-round. Always be prepared. This message brought to you by the Beaufort South District Disaster Preparedness Committee and NEMO, and funded by the USAID Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to the discussion program. If you're just joining us, our guest in studio today, the Director of Works, Mr. Angel Shalmine, our Deputy Permanent Secretary, Mr. Calvin Lee, and the Director of Met Services, Mr. Andre Joye. Let's continue, gentlemen, with where we left off. We were speaking about the hurricane shelters. I want to speak about the impact that we expect the increased storms to have on our infrastructure. How do we begin calculating those impacts?
This is a good one. The impact of the post storm, like we said earlier, one of the functions of the ministry, and not just the Ministry of Infrastructure, different ministries, after the storm, one of the functions would be to have their personnel out in the field assessing damages, for instance, to bridges and roadways and buildings and that sort of thing. The value, that information would then be sent to NEMO, which would actually be the entity, or it should be
Pretty much the
command center for response to a national event. And if we're looking at the cost of rebuilding that damaged infrastructure per ministry or per institution, all of that would be fed into it would, at that time it would be NEMO or NEMAC.
Right, and then the damage assessment report.
And then you have the damage assessment report prepared, which is the damage assessment needs analysis, the DANA. That committee would be responsible for correlating all of those reports and those assessments and those individual costings in preparation for reports to be submitted to NEMAC, and you would come out with sort of the costing of or the damage value.
Right, very similarly to what Mr. Shannon said, the Ministry of Infrastructure plays that particular role in terms of, in our assessments of the physical infrastructure, feed that back into NEMO and NEMAC as we are a critical part of that department, that agency. They collate what would be a national assessment of the impact of the storm.
Yeah.
So we would deal with it from a public physical infrastructure point of view. The other agencies deal with what they're responsible for. An overall report can be developed and then used by both national, regional, and international agencies to determine their responses and assistance to Saint Lucia in the after effects.
The impact is always great.
It is always great.
It's always great.
I should add that NEMO is the custodian for the impacts database, so they collect all data in terms of what is happening on the ground.
What can our
they record.
citizens, and we could stick with the Met Director here, what can our citizens do to limit the impact? What role do our people have or can play?
Right. So, I mean, if I could start, really,
Please.
from an individual perspective, each citizen, each resident, each homeowner could be responsible for maintaining their own home. So ensuring that, branches of trees and so on are not overhanging on their roofs or over other people's properties. Their roofs are intact so that they don't get blown off during a storm. That the drains around their homes are cleared so that runoff water, rainwater and so on
Can get into the main drains.
Can get to the main drains, one, and it doesn't cause flooding in the immediate surroundings. So for example, the disposal of refuse, of solid waste and whatnot, should be done in a responsible manner so that it doesn't impact yourself or your neighbor, right?
And it doesn't find itself in the water courses during the event. And going a little further to that, Calvin, we could look at what the community can do on a whole in terms of the disaster committee groups can come together and clean up the community in terms of garbage collection, garbage cleanup, because at the end of the day, all of that garbage finds itself into the drains, you get the drains clogged, and you start getting the effects of flooding.
Of course, those are personal actions that our citizens can take. There's a school of thought that if you invest in better infrastructure, that too can help mitigate the impact.
Yes, that is also true, Shannon. But we need to also look at the fact that a lot of times, like you say, it's a school of thought that building resilience into your infrastructure can lessen on the impact during a storm. But on another note, sometimes you would be, as an individual, would be looking at it this way. You have other individuals within your community that probably do not subscribe to that school of thought. So as a community togetherness, with the influence of your disaster community groups. I keep stressing on disaster community groups because I think this is where we need to start taglining this thing properly, because if the groups are able to bring the citizens together, each community, then you could imagine what the positive impact will be on the island itself. We will have most people start to think along the line of, if I do my part, then I am contributing to a better response after post storm.
Yeah, and I also think part of the response is any repairs that you do to your home, try to do it in a manner that is more resilient. So you use your hurricane straps on your roof. You develop water storage. That's being encouraged throughout, especially in the event of the drought seasons and the more intense systems that we have. So we're going to see periods of prolonged periods, dry periods. So have rainwater harvesting, or, sufficient water storage to carry your family through. So measures like that can be encouraged by each individual citizen through the community groups as well, so that you have that
Partnership.
Yeah, that partnership, and a whole community standing together to weather, pun intended, to weather the storms.
I don't want the Director of Med Services to feel left out, not at all, but I want to go back to what the forecast is. We're saying, and it's pretty interesting, we're saying more intense storms. However, the year started in what was a dry period. Normally when we think of storms, we think of rainfall as well. Bit interesting that you predicting greater intensity, but we still seeing longer periods of dry spells. Is there an explanation for that?
Well, like I said, it's a year of intensities. So on one end, dry spells, on the other end, more intense storms. But climatically, the prediction was that the region will be warmer. That would increase the sea surface temperatures, which is a key element in storms. And the intensity would mean that you'd have stronger winds and more rainfall. But you would not have, in between the systems, the storms, you wouldn't have that much rainfall. So you'd have intense rainfall in short periods. So that would cause more damage than you have prolonged rainfall.
How intense are those storms forecasted?
Well, if you take example from Dominica, they were hit by 2 Category 5s, which has not happened before, well, in living memory. So we have to prepare for the worst case scenario. I mentioned earlier that the year would be more intense, the hurricane season. I should also point out that our more active season is around August, September. That's when
so we're not
the
there.
Caribbean. No, we're not. So this is a good starting point where we can sensitize the public about being prepared and playing their role.
Right. We winding down now, so we'll just give each of you a moment to share with our citizens your final message, and we'll start with you, Mr. Director. We always say to people, follow and listen out for the weather reports. Is that your continued message to them?
Yes. I should also say that it only takes one system to devastate the island. So a person should continue making the preparation. It's like preparing for carnival. Put things in place every year
Carnival.
so that you could weather the storm.
The only difference is we
have no carnival.
We ensure that carnival always comes. Deputy Permanent Secretary.
Right, thank you. So my message to our residents, our citizens, would be, well, partly as Mrs. Joy says, be prepared and do what you can to protect yourself, your family, your fellow colleagues, your community. So ensure that you have your hurricane supplies at your home. So some food supplies to carry you through and whatnot. Clear the drains around your home, encourage that. Ensure that the structure that you live in can withstand a storm, or at least if it's not in that condition, know where you can go to. The closest home, the closest shelter, and so on. But it's to be very open to and listen to what's going on around you and participate as you can.
And the final word with you, Director.
Okay, it's along the same veins with the DPS. What we would want to encourage is that individuals look at their residents, ensure that their roofs are intact, their water systems are okay, their storage is okay, and it must be said that persons don't need to do this on their own. There are persons out here, there are engineers, there are persons that you could get to actually assist with those sorts of assessments, because the normal person may not know exactly what it is that I'm looking for to ensure that my house is safe. So I'm saying that you could reach out and get the assistance to ensure that those things are in place, and they need to listen to official broadcasts, which is critical, that persons listen to the official broadcasts for those, during those periods, and not just follow the whole, how you call it?
Social media.
The social
gossip.
media gossip thing. And they have to be rest assured that amid the COVID period, that we are doing everything in our power to get those shelters prepared and to have the protocols in place so that if it needs to be, God forbid, that we have to use them, that it would be safe for persons to go to.
I think we could all agree that valuable information was shared here over the last 30 minutes, and we thank each and every one of you for contributing to this discussion program. We had on set this series, we had Mr. Angel Shalman. He is the Director of Works at the Department of Infrastructure. Our Deputy Permanent Secretary also joined the panel, along with the Director of the Met Services, Mr. Andre Joye. The 2020 season is forecast to be extremely busy. We are doing our responsibility and playing our role at the Department of Infrastructure to be prepared. However, you also have a very important responsibility as a citizen to play your part and be prepared. This has been the first in a three-part discussion series produced by the Department of Infrastructure. My name is Shannon Lebourne. Thanking you so much for joining us.